Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you'd like to submit a story, feel free to do so in the comments down below or on my email. Alright, now let's dive into today's story. I didn't leave my job because I hated it. Well, maybe I did. But it wasn't the kind of hate that boils over or makes you lash out. It was the slow, creeping kind. The kind that builds over months, maybe even years, until one day you wake up and realize you can't stand the thought of doing it for even one more day. That's where I was. I worked in marketing, which sounds a lot more exciting than it really is. Most of my days were spent sitting in meetings that could have been emails or staring at spreadsheets that made my eyes cross. It wasn't the worst job in the world, but it wasn't the best either. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost track of why I was even doing it. Money, I guess. Stability. But none of it felt worth it anymore. So one morning, I walked into the office, handed in my resignation, and walked out. Just like that. No backup plan. No new job lined up. I figured I could live off my savings for a while and figure things out later. For the first time in years, I felt free. At first, it was great. I slept in as late as I wanted, spent entire days binge-watching shows I'd been too busy to keep up with, took long walks without checking my phone every 5 minutes. For the first couple of weeks, it felt like a vacation, a chance to finally breathe. No deadlines, no pressure, just time to myself. But then reality started to creep in. There's only so much TV you can watch before it stops being fun. The long walks turned into restless pacing, and the freedom I'd been so excited about started to feel more like aimlessness. Relaxing isn't so satisfying when you don't feel like you've earned it, you know? The days blurred together until I couldn't even tell you what I'd done with my time. It was like I was drifting, caught in some kind of void. The worst part was the quiet. When you're used to being busy all the time, the silence can get to you. It gives your brain too much room to think about all the stuff you've been avoiding. Like, what's next? How long can I keep this up before the money runs out? Did I make a mistake? Those questions circled in my head like vultures, especially late at night when there was nothing to distract me. I tried to keep myself busy. I picked up a few hobbies I'd abandoned over the years. Reading, cooking, even a bit of sketching. I found an old set of pencils and a sketch pad buried in the back of my closet and figured, why not? But none of it really stuck. The books piled up half-read, the meals got repetitive, and the sketch pad was abandoned after a week. My attention span felt shot, like I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes. My friends still had jobs and routines, so it wasn't like I could just call someone up in the middle of the day to hang out. Most of the time, it was just me, my thoughts, and the four walls of my apartment. Social media didn't help. Seeing everyone else's carefully curated lives made me feel even more disconnected, like I was falling behind in some invisible race. Eventually, I started going out more. Not for anything specific, just to be around people. Coffee shops, parks, even the grocery store. Anywhere I could hear the hum of conversation and feel a little less alone. It helped, a little. There was something comforting about the normalcy of it all. Watching strangers go about their day gave me a sense of grounding, like maybe I wasn't as lost as I felt. But it wasn't enough to shake the nagging feeling that I was stuck. I didn't regret leaving my job, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was floating in this weird limbo, unsure of what came next. It's hard to describe, but it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you need to jump but not having any idea what's waiting at the bottom. That's when things started to change. I didn't know it at the time, but everything was about to take a turn I never could have predicted. But I'll get to that later. It started like any other random night out. One of my friends dragged me to some party they heard about from a coworker or a neighbor or someone I didn't know. I almost didn't go. I wasn't in the mood for small talk or awkwardly trying to figure out where to stand in a room full of strangers. But I'd been cooped up for too long, and I figured it might do me some good to get out of my apartment. The house was one of those trendy fixer-uppers with exposed brick walls and minimalist furniture that looked too expensive to actually use. Music thumped from a Bluetooth speaker in the corner, and the air smelled like beer and cheap cologne. The vibe was lively, almost overwhelming. I grabbed a drink from a cooler near the door and tried to fade into the background, observing instead of engaging. The kitchen was the unofficial gathering spot, as it always is at these things. A crowd had formed around the counter, everyone laughing and talking at once. It was a mix of people who clearly knew each other, and others, like me, who were hovering on the outskirts, trying to blend in. That's when I noticed him. Alexander. He wasn't the loudest or most animated person in the room, but he had this way of commanding attention without trying. He was tall, lean, with black hair that fell just past his shoulders in a way that somehow looked both effortless and deliberate. He was dressed in dark clothes, a simple black shirt and jeans, but he wore them like they were tailored just for him. His nails were painted black, a subtle detail that somehow stood out more than anything else. Alexander was in the middle of telling a story, his voice carrying just enough to draw people in without being overpowering. Even though I couldn't hear the start of it, I could tell it was funny by the way everyone around him hung on his words, their laughter erupting at all the right moments. I caught myself smiling along with them, even though I didn't know what I was smiling at. When he finished, the group erupted into laughter, and Alexander leaned back, casually sipping his drink like he didn't even notice the attention he'd just commanded. Then his eyes landed on me. For a second, I thought he'd look away, but instead, he gave me a small nod and raised his drink in a casual salute. Before I could decide whether to say something or just nod back, he made his way over to me. "Hey," he said, holding out a hand. "Alexander." "Oh, hi," I stammered, shaking his hand. Don't tell me," he interrupted, a playful grin spreading across his face. "You're here because your friend dragged you out, right? Didn't really want to come, but figured why not?" I blinked, caught off guard. "How'd you know?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter like he'd done this 100 times before. "You've got that look, like you're already planning your escape route but feel too polite to leave." I laughed despite myself. "Yeah, that sounds about right." "Thought so," he said, his grin widening. "Well, since we're both here, might as well make the best of it, right? Want a drink?" Before I could answer, he grabbed 2 beers from the cooler on the floor and handed me one. It was cold and already dripping condensation, and I took it more out of reflex than anything else. Alexander didn't wait for me to respond before launching into another story, this one about an Uber passenger who had once serenaded him with the entire soundtrack of Bohemian Rhapsody during a 20-minute ride. "Wait, he sang the whole thing?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Every word," Alexander said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. He even tried to get me to harmonize. We spent the next hour talking, and I have to admit, it was easy, effortless even. Alexander had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like what you were saying was genuinely interesting. He told me more about his job driving for Uber and all the weird passengers he'd had. One guy tried to pay him with what he claimed was a collector's coin, worth way more than the fare. Another left behind a sketch pad filled with the creepiest drawings Alexander said he'd ever seen. "Did you keep it?" I asked. "Hell no," he said, laughing. "I left it at the lost and found and never looked back." By the end of the night, I'd almost forgotten how reluctant I'd been to come in the first place. Alexander had this way of putting people at ease, of making everything feel lighter and less serious. When we finally swapped numbers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "We should grab drinks sometime," he said. "Or something. You seem cool." I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, sounds good." At the time, it was just a random night and a chance meeting. I didn't think much of it beyond that, just another person I met in passing at some party. But sometimes, those small, seemingly unimportant moments end up setting off a chain reaction you can't predict. One minute you're at a random party, and the next, your life starts heading in a direction you never could have imagined. After the party, Alexander and I started hanging out more. It wasn't anything planned or formal at first, just the occasional text about meeting up for a drink or catching a movie. He was one of those people who made it easy to say yes. There was something unpretentious about him that felt refreshing, like he didn't need to try to impress anyone. The first time we hung out one-on-one was at a local dive bar he recommended. It was the kind of place with sticky floors, dim lighting, and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Alexander was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the corner with 2 beers waiting on the table. He waved me over, and as I slid into the booth, he grinned. "Told you this place was a gem," he said, gesturing around. "Yeah, it's got character," I said, eyeing the duct-taped bar stools. "Character's just code for charm," he said with a wink, clinking his beer against mine. We ended up staying there for hours. Alexander had this endless supply of stories, mostly about his time driving for Uber. He told me about a bachelorette party that crammed into his car and spilled champagne everywhere, and about a guy who insisted on riding in complete silence, except for the sound of an audiobook he refused to explain. Then there was the woman who left her purse in his car and called him 15 times in a panic before realizing it had been on her the whole time. It wasn't just the stories that were entertaining. It was the way he told them. He had a knack for painting a vivid picture, and his timing was perfect. Each story felt like a scene in a movie, complete with dramatic pauses and perfectly delivered punchlines. Even the bartender kept drifting over to eavesdrop on our conversation. As the night went on, I realized how easy it was to talk to him. I told him about quitting my job, about how I wasn't sure what was next. He listened without judgment, nodding like he genuinely understood. "Sounds like you needed a break," he said simply. "Nothing wrong with that." "Yeah, but it feels weird," I admitted. "Like I should be doing something, you know?" "You're figuring it out," he said. "That's something. Most people don't even get that far." It was such a small thing to say, but it stuck with me. It felt good to talk to someone who didn't immediately jump in with advice or questions. He just got it. And he didn't make me feel like I had to have everything figured out right away. After that, Hanging out with Alexander became a regular thing. Sometimes we'd grab food, other times we'd meet up at his place. His house was a little sparse, a little too quiet, but it felt comfortable in its own way. He never made a big deal about it, though. "It's just a place to sleep," he'd say with a shrug. The house had quirks, though, and I couldn't help but notice them the more time I spent there. The lack of personal touches, no photos, no mementos, made it feel more like a rental than a home. And then there was the basement door. It had that same heavy padlock, rusted and worn, like it had been there forever. "You ever think about getting rid of that thing?" I asked one night, pointing at the door while we were sitting on his couch eating takeout and watching an old action movie. Alexander glanced over and smirked. "What, the door?" "The lock," I said. "Looks like it's holding up a medieval dungeon." "I think it adds character," he said, echoing his earlier joke about the bar. "What's actually down there?" I asked, only half joking. "Junk," he said, taking a bite of his food. "Old stuff from the previous owner. You wouldn't believe the crap people leave behind." I thought about pressing further but decided against it. Everyone has their quirks, and honestly, it didn't seem that weird at the time. Just another locked door in a house that was already full of odd little details. One evening, Alexander mentioned an Uber passenger who claimed to be psychic. "She told me I had an old soul," he said, laughing. "Whatever that means." Then she asked if I ever feel like I'm being watched. "That's not creepy at all," I said, rolling my eyes. "Right?" he said. "She left me a 5-star review, though, so I guess it could have been worse." Moments like that stuck with me. Alexander was good at brushing things off, but there was a strange undertone to some of the stories he told. Not enough to set off alarm bells, just enough to linger in the back of my mind. Looking back, maybe those quirks and offhand comments should have been red flags, but at the time, they were just small pieces of a bigger picture I wasn't seeing yet. It all felt like harmless fun, just another night with a friend. It was Alexander's idea to have a boys' night at his place. "Beer, pizza, bad action movies," he said over text. The holy trifecta. I didn't need much convincing. By that point, hanging out with Alexander had become part of my routine. He was easy to be around, and a low-key night at his place sounded like just what I needed. When I arrived, Alexander opened the door with his usual grin, a cold beer already in hand. "Perfect timing," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Pizza just got here." The smell of pepperoni and melted cheese hit me as I walked into the house. It was the same as always. Quiet, sparsely furnished, with that faint creak in the floorboards that made it feel older than it probably was. The padlocked basement door caught my eye as I passed by, but I didn't say anything about it this time. The living room was set up for the night. A stack of DVDs sat next to the TV, most of them with titles like Explosive Justice or Death Chase 3. 2 boxes of pizza were on the coffee table, along with a 6-pack of beer and a bag of chips. Alexander flopped onto the couch, grabbing a slice of pizza and motioning for me to do the same. "First up," he said, holding up a DVD case. "This masterpiece of cinema." The cover showed a man in a leather jacket holding a flamethrower, with explosions in the background. "That looks terrible," I said, laughing. "Exactly," Alexander said. "You'll love it." We spent the next couple of hours eating, drinking, and tearing apart the movie. The plot made no sense, the acting was wooden, and the special effects looked like they were done on a high school budget. But that was the fun of it. Every ridiculous line and over-the-top stunt gave us something to laugh about. The beers flowed freely, and the pizza disappeared quicker than either of us expected. It felt like the kind of night you'd have in college, just pure, stupid fun. Halfway through the second movie, I started to feel a little restless. The house was always quiet, but that night, it felt almost too quiet. I chalked it up to the beer making me overthink things. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, the kind of stuff that happens when you're not fully paying attention to the movie. Still, it lingered, that nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. At one point, during a lull in the conversation, I thought I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the house. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. I glanced at Alexander, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the TV, laughing at some overacted fight scene. I decided to let it go. "You okay?" Alexander asked a little while later, noticing my distracted expression. "Yeah," I said quickly, just zoned out for a second. He nodded, popping open another beer. "Long day?" "Something like that," I said, trying to shake off the weird vibe. As the night went on, the feeling persisted. The whispers didn't come back, but the air in the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. It was subtle, like the kind of pressure you feel before a storm. I found myself glancing at the basement door more often than I wanted to admit. It stood there, silent and immovable, as if daring me to ask about it again. But I didn't. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. Too many beers, too many bad action movies. Alexander didn't seem fazed by any of it. He was as relaxed as ever, sprawled out on the couch, throwing popcorn at the TV whenever a particularly cheesy line came up. "This guy's supposed to be a cop," he said, gesturing at the screen. "Looks like he's never even held a gun." "Maybe that's the twist," I joked. "He's actually an actor pretending to be a cop." Alexander chuckled. Now that would be a movie worth watching. By the time the credits rolled on the second movie, it was past midnight. The house felt even quieter than before. Alexander yawned, stretching his arms over his head. "Another beer?" he asked. "Nah, I'm good," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "I should probably head out." "Suit yourself," he said, walking me to the door. "Good hang, though. Let's do it again soon." By the time I left, the weird feeling hadn't gone away, but I brushed it off as nothing. After all, it had been a good night, fun even, and if there was one thing I knew about myself, it was that I had a tendency to overthink things. It was just a boys' night, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. A week after the boys' night at Alexander's place, he invited me back over. He didn't specify why, just sent me a text. "Come by later? Got something you've got to see." That was Alexander. Always vague, always making things sound more interesting than they probably were. When I arrived, it was just starting to get dark. Alexander opened the door with his usual grin, stepping aside to let me in. The house was the same as always, quiet, a little too empty, and just slightly off in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. "What's the big reveal?" I asked, shrugging off my jacket. "Patience," he said with a laugh. "You'll see. But first, beer." He handed me a cold one from the fridge and led me into the living room. The coffee table was covered with what looked like old maps and papers, but Alexander quickly scooped them up and tossed them onto a nearby chair. "Work stuff," he said casually. "Don't worry about it." We settled in, the TV murmuring in the background as we talked. Alexander, as always, had a million stories to share, most of them about his passengers and their bizarre antics. He never really showed me the thing he was talking about, but to be honest, I completely forgot about it. I was halfway through my second beer when it happened. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. A faint sound, so soft it could have been the wind, drifting in from somewhere deeper in the house. But then it came again, a whisper, low and insistent, like someone trying to speak through a closed door. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up. "Hear what?" Alexander said, looking genuinely confused. "That whispering," I said. "It's coming from..." Before I could finish, the sound faded, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint crackle of the TV. Alexander stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Man, you're too easy," he said, shaking his head. "You've been watching too many horror movies." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease stuck with me. The sound hadn't been loud, but it had been clear, and it hadn't felt like something my imagination would conjure up. Alexander put on another movie, something even more ridiculous than the last, and I did my best to focus. We joked about the over-the-top plot twists, laughed at the cheesy dialogue, and shared more stories about our lives. But every so often, I caught myself glancing toward the hallway. The whispers didn't come back, but the house felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. At one point, Alexander got up to grab more drinks, and I found myself alone in the living room. For a moment, I considered walking over to the hallway to see if I could hear anything. The thought of standing in front of the basement door, though, sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed put, trying to convince myself that I was just being ridiculous. "Here you go," Alexander said as he returned, handing me another beer. "Don't tell me you're still thinking about that ghost nonsense." "I'm not," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Good," he said, settling back onto the couch. "Ghosts aren't real, man. Trust me." We finished the movie, and the whispers didn't return. Alexander seemed completely at ease, cracking jokes and throwing popcorn at the screen. His laid-back demeanor made it easy to forget the strange feeling that had crept over me earlier. By the time the credits rolled, I was almost convinced it had all been in my head. When I finally left, the night felt darker than usual. The walk was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound around you. I told myself to stop overthinking it. It had been a good night, like always. Just another hangout with a friend. The memory of that whispering sound lingered. It played over and over in my mind, low and urgent, like it was trying to tell me something I didn't understand. Another week went by before Alexander invited me over again. This time the invitation felt different. Instead of a quick text, he actually called me, which was rare for him. "Hey," he said, "you free tonight?" "Yeah, what's up?" "I was thinking you should come over and crash here," he said. His tone was casual, but there was an odd pause before he continued. "I've got some cool stuff I want to show you. We can hang out, watch movies, the usual." A sleepover wasn't something Alexander had suggested before, but I didn't think much of it. He always had a way of making things sound more interesting than they probably were. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" When I arrived, it was just starting to get dark. Alexander greeted me at the door with his usual grin, but something about his demeanor felt off. He seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder every so often like he was expecting someone else. "What's with you?" I asked as I stepped inside and shrugged off my jacket. "Nothing," he said quickly, brushing it off. "Come on, I've got something to show you." The house felt the same as always, quiet, sparse, and slightly colder than it should have been. As we passed the padlocked basement door, something caught my eye. Faint scratches surrounded the edges of the doorframe, like someone, or something, had been clawing at it. My stomach tightened, but I didn't say anything. Alexander led me to the dining room, where an unusual setup was waiting on the table. Several old yellowed maps were spread out, along with what looked like handwritten notes scrawled in a messy, frantic script. In the center of it all was a small, ornate box. It was made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer as the light shifted. "What's all this?" I asked, leaning in for a closer look. "Picked it up at this estate sale," Alexander said casually. "The guy running it said the box is over 100 years old. Thought it'd be fun to check out." "Fun how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged. "I don't know. Open it, see what's inside." Something about the box made my skin crawl. The carvings looked almost alive, like they were writhing under the surface. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. "You open it," I said, stepping back. Alexander chuckled. "Seriously? It's just a box. What's there to be freaked out about?" Before I could answer, a sound interrupted us. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, but the way Alexander's expression changed told me he'd heard it too. He froze, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Probably just the wind," Alexander said quickly, though he didn't sound convinced. We stood there for a moment listening. The whisper came again, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from the direction of the basement door. My chest tightened, and my breath quickened as I glanced at Alexander. "Still think it's the wind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Alexander didn't answer right away. He stared at the hallway, his jaw tight. Then, as if on autopilot, he walked toward the basement door. I followed, my curiosity battling with the knot of fear in my stomach. When we reached the door, the whispering stopped. Alexander ran his hand over the padlock, frowning. "It's locked," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Yeah, I can see that," I said. "What's down there anyway?" He hesitated, then gave the same answer he always did. "Just junk." "Then why does it sound like someone's down there?" I pressed. Alexander shook his head, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to unease. "It's nothing," he said finally. "Come on, let's get back to the living room." But as we turned to leave, the whispering started again. This time it wasn't faint or distant. It was loud, clear, and impossibly close. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. Alexander nodded, and we quickly retreated to the living room. The moment we sat down, the whispers stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. Alexander turned on a movie, but I could barely focus. My mind kept drifting back to the basement door and the sound that seemed to come from the depths of the house. When it got late, Alexander gestured toward the guest room. "You can crash in there," he said. "Sheets are clean." I hesitated but nodded. As unsettling as the night had been, I wasn't about to walk home in the middle of the night. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sound of those whispers, or the feeling that something, or someone, was just beyond that locked door. If only I'd trusted that feeling. I don't know how long I lay in bed staring at the ceiling that night. The guest room was dark, with only faint slivers of moonlight filtering through the blinds. The silence was thick, pressing in around me like a physical weight. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine. The whispers were just my imagination, nothing more. But then I heard it again. It started faint, barely a sound at all, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. Words. "Run away." I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice was low, almost a hiss. I sat up, the mattress creaking beneath me. Then I heard another whisper. "He only attacks when the lights are out." My heart was racing now, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. The words didn't make sense, but they sent a chill through me that I couldn't ignore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor. The chill from the wood sent a shock through my body, making everything feel sharper, more real. Then I heard another whisper. It said, "He shows his true form when his victims are most scared." The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt even more oppressive than the noise. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I'd just heard. My mind raced, jumping from one possibility to another. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was half asleep and imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers weren't coming from my head. They were real. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't know where I was going, but staying in the guest room felt unbearable. The walls seemed to press inward, the shadows stretching longer with every breath I took. I opened the door, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The house was completely dark, the kind of darkness that felt almost alive. My eyes struggled to adjust, and for a moment I thought I saw movement at the end of the hall. "Alexander?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I took a step forward, then another. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. The hallway felt longer than it should have, stretching out in front of me like a tunnel. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, and it made my stomach churn. I reached the living room, the faint glow of the TV casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was empty. "Alexander?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. "Leave. Run while you still can." I turned toward the basement door. It loomed in the shadows, the padlock glinting faintly in the dim light. The scratches around the edges seemed deeper now, more jagged, as if whatever had made them was growing more desperate. The air near the door was colder, biting against my skin, and I thought I saw frost forming along the edge of the wood. "He's not what he seems," said another whisper. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The words echoed in my mind, overlapping and twisting together until they were almost impossible to distinguish. My head was spinning, and I grabbed onto the edge of the couch to steady myself. But then a strange curiosity overtook me. It was almost irrational, like a pull I couldn't resist. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but it was eclipsed by the need to know. What's down there? What's behind that door? I turned back to the basement door, my gaze lingering on the padlock. The whispers had stopped, and in their absence, the silence felt almost like an invitation. Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached for the padlock. It felt colder than it should have, like it had been sitting in ice. My fingers fumbled with it, but to my surprise, it clicked open easily. I hadn't seen Alexander unlock it earlier, but somehow it wasn't secured anymore. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a staircase that disappeared into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, but it carried an overwhelming smell of bleach. It was sharp and clean, almost sterile, like someone had scrubbed every surface down religiously. The scent was so strong it made my nose sting and my stomach churn. I hesitated, gripping the doorframe as I stared into the void below. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to close the door and walk away, but my curiosity pushed me forward. "Alexander?" I called out again, my voice trembling. The only answer was the echo of my own voice. I took a step onto the staircase, the wood groaning under my weight. Then another. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, the faint glow from the living room fading with every step. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the black, revealing rough stone walls and a floor littered with debris. My flashlight flickered, and my breath hitched. I spun around, the light dancing across the walls, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and crashing into one another until they were a deafening roar in my mind. The silence after was unbearable. My flashlight flickered again, and I thought I saw something, a shadow, tall and twisted just out of reach. My legs felt frozen, my body refusing to move as the air grew colder still. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, but I didn't hear the door slam shut behind me. Not yet. If I'd known what waited for me in that basement, I never would have opened the door. The basement was much larger than I had imagined. As I descended the stairs, the beam from my phone's flashlight barely made a dent in the thick darkness. The stone walls stretched far beyond the reach of the light, their rough texture casting strange shadows. The floor was smooth concrete, oddly clean, and the overwhelming smell of bleach lingered in the air, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I took a few tentative steps forward, my shoes echoing faintly against the emptiness. The space felt wrong, too expansive for a house of this size. It was like stepping into a cavern, the air heavy and still, pressing down on me with an almost tangible weight. The whispers that had drawn me down here were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound I made. I swung the flashlight around, the beam catching glimpses of oddities scattered across the room. An old, rusted chair in one corner, shelves lined with nondescript boxes, a broken mirror leaning against the wall, its jagged edges reflecting distorted shards of light. It felt like a place frozen in time, abandoned and yet meticulously maintained. And then I saw them. The first body was slumped against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, I didn't register what I was seeing at first. My brain tried to process it as something else. A mannequin, maybe, or a Halloween decoration left to gather dust. But as I approached, the sickening reality set in. It was a man, his face contorted in a mask of terror. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was frozen mid-scream. His clothes were torn and bloodied, and his skin had an unnatural pallor, almost waxy in the cold light of my phone. The sight made my stomach churn, and I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. But he wasn't alone. As I swung the flashlight around, more bodies came into view. They were arranged haphazardly across the room, some propped against the walls, others sprawled on the floor. Each one was a tableau of horror, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and fear. One man had his tongue pulled out, the flesh around his mouth mutilated beyond recognition. Another had a leg severed, the stump crudely bandaged, as though someone had tried and failed to keep him alive. A woman lay nearby, her chest carved open in a grotesque pattern that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, the light shaking in my trembling hand. There were at least 24 bodies, maybe more, each one telling its own story of pain and violence. The bleach smell was overwhelming now, a sickening contrast to the scene before me. Someone had been trying to clean this place, to hide the evidence, but no amount of scrubbing could erase the horror that lingered here. "Alexander," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The name felt foreign on my tongue, as though saying it aloud would summon him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had to know about this. There was no way anyone could have this many corpses in their basement without knowing. The thought made my legs weak, and I leaned against the wall to steady myself. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way to rationalize what I was seeing. But there was no rationalizing this. No amount of denial could erase the truth staring me in the face. I turned toward the stairs, desperate to get out of that place, but my legs felt like lead. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the room pressing down on me like a physical force. The flashlight flickered again, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the light, a shadow shifting against the far wall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. I took another step toward the stairs, my body screaming at me to run, to get out of there while I still could. But as I reached the base of the stairs, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart, but they grew louder with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come here. Turn back. It's too late now." The words wrapped around me, suffocating and relentless. I stumbled up the stairs, my flashlight barely illuminating the steps ahead. My mind was a blur of panic and confusion. The images of the corpses burned into my vision. I reached the door, slamming into it with my shoulder, and turned the knob with shaking hands. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, and I yanked at the knob again, harder this time. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and crashing into one another. My flashlight flickered one last time and went out, plunging me into darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs behind me. Darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, as if the basement itself were alive and watching. The footsteps behind me grew louder, their pace slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, the whispers from moments earlier echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have come here. It's too late now. But then something in me snapped. Survival instinct took over. I fumbled for my phone, shaking so badly it slipped from my hand and hit the concrete floor with a sickening crack. The flashlight flickered back on for a moment, illuminating the stairs and the door at the top, before dying completely. Damn it, I whispered, crouching to retrieve the phone. My fingers brushed against its cold surface, and as I stood, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound itself. I turned, holding the phone up as if it could shield me from whatever was lurking in the shadows. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. The only answer was the faint echo of my own words. A cold wind swept through the basement, carrying with it the sterile smell of bleach and something else. Something metallic and sour, like blood. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, my shoulder brushing against the stone wall. I had to get out. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay. I reached the stairs and began to climb, each step feeling steeper than the last. My legs felt like lead, and the darkness seemed to thicken around me, swallowing the faint light from the top of the staircase. Halfway up, I felt it, a presence behind me. It wasn't the footsteps this time. It was something else. Heavy, oppressive, like a weight bearing down on my shoulders. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the top of the stairs, my hands found the door, and I gripped the knob with all my strength. To my relief, it turned, and the door creaked open, spilling dim light from the living room into the stairwell. I stepped through, slamming the door shut behind me. My breathing was ragged, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I leaned against the door, my body trembling. The house was eerily silent. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood beneath my feet. I forced myself to move, one step at a time toward the front door. My only thought was getting out. Away from the house, away from the basement, away from him. I reached the front door and placed my hand on the handle. Just as I was about to pull it open, something made me stop. It was an instinct, a sense that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned around. My breath caught in my throat. Alexander stood at the top of the stairs leading to the second floor, but it wasn't the Alexander I knew, or thought I knew. His body was stretched, elongated in a way that made him look barely human. His eyes were grotesquely large and round, glowing like polished marbles under the faint light. They were so unnaturally wide it felt like they could swallow me whole, with pupils reduced to sharp, tiny pinpricks that drilled into me. His mouth gaped open in a grotesque grin, exposing rows of jagged, razor-like teeth that gleamed wetly as thick strands of drool spilled down his chin. His hair was the worst part. It wasn't just long, it was impossibly long, flowing down his back, over his shoulders, and cascading all the way to the very bottom of the stairs. The strands didn't lie still. They moved, swaying and curling like living tendrils, stretching and brushing against the steps as if they were alive. It must have been over 10 feet long, writhing with an eerie sentience, as though searching for something, or someone. The hair seemed alive, a twisted extension of him, and its purposeful movement made my skin crawl. "Come back," he said, his voice ragged and mechanical, like a broken recording on a loop. The casual tone of his words was terrifyingly out of place, clashing horribly with the inhuman distortion of his voice. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my hand still gripping the door handle. His smile widened as he stepped closer, his movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on invisible strings. His hair stretched further toward me, almost as if it were reaching to grab me, and his eyes narrowed slightly, locking onto me with an intensity that pierced through my very soul. "What's wrong?" he rasped, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "Don't you want to sleep over?" The question hit me like a slap, breaking the spell that held me in place. Just as he lunged forward, his limbs bending grotesquely as he launched himself on all fours, I yanked the door open and stumbled outside. Cold night air hit my face as I fell onto the porch, scrambling backward. I heard him behind me, felt a cold, clawed hand brush against my shoulder. I screamed, throwing myself forward and slamming the door shut with all the strength I could muster. My back hit the porch railing, and I sat there gasping for air, staring at the house. Every fiber of my being expected him to burst through the door or the window, his monstrous form chasing me into the street. But nothing happened. The house remained eerily quiet, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my body trembling with adrenaline and terror. Finally, I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and unsteady. I stumbled down the steps and into the street, breaking into a run as soon as I found my footing. I didn't stop until the house was out of sight, and even then I kept running. The image of Alexander's monstrous grin, terrible eyes and writhing hair burned into my mind. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and I had no intention of ever going back to find out more. The first thing I did after catching my breath was run. I stumbled down the street, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse at any moment. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, far enough that the house was out of sight, and the oppressive sense of being watched had started to fade. Only then did I fumble for my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what I'd seen. My voice shook as I told them about the basement, the bodies, and Alexander. I half expected them not to believe me, to dismiss it as a prank or the ramblings of someone who had too much to drink. But they took me seriously. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside my apartment, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the walls. The officers took my statement as I sat on the edge of my couch, still shaking. They assured me they'd send a team to investigate the house immediately. When they came back hours later, it wasn't the relief I had hoped for. Instead, their tone was colder, more cautious. One officer, a stocky man with a stern expression, asked me to come with them to the station. "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. "We have a few more questions," he said. His voice was even, but I could tell something had shifted. At the station, they questioned me for hours. They pressed for details about Alexander, about how I knew him, and about what I was doing in the house. I could feel their suspicion growing as I stumbled over my words, trying to explain the surreal, nightmarish events I'd witnessed. The fact that I had no solid proof of Alexander's existence didn't help. "So, let me get this straight," one officer said, leaning forward. "You're saying you went to a house with this Alexander, who has no record of living there, and you just happened to stumble across a basement full of bodies?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth. He was there. He attacked me." They exchanged glances, their skepticism clear. "And yet, there's no evidence of this Alexander. No personal belongings, no fingerprints, nothing tying anyone to that house except you." Panic bubbled in my chest. "I'm not lying. You have to believe me. The bodies, they're real." Another officer sighed. "We did find remains in the basement, but the state they were in, they don't look older than a week. It's strange, though. There's no sign of how they got there, or who might have done it. There's no connection to this Alexander you mentioned. They kept me for what felt like hours, probing every detail of my story, looking for holes, waiting for me to slip up. But eventually, they let me go. Without evidence linking me to the house or the bodies, they couldn't hold me. Still, the way they looked at me as I left, like I was a liar or worse, made my skin crawl. When the call came from the police later that night, I could barely bring myself to answer. The officer on the other end sounded calm, almost clinical, as he relayed the findings. "Sir, we did a thorough sweep of the house you described," he said. "We found no trace of anyone living there. The house appears abandoned, and there's no sign of a man matching the description you gave us." My heart sank. "But the bodies, you had to find them. They were there, in the basement," I insisted. There was a pause on the other end. "We did find something," the officer admitted. "The basement you described is there, and it matches the layout you mentioned. But it's empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. However, there are remains. They appear to have been there for some time." I swallowed hard. "And Alexander?" "There's no record of anyone by that name connected to the property," the officer said. "In fact, there's no indication anyone named Alexander has ever lived in this area." I hung up the phone in a daze. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I'd seen and heard. The bodies were real. That much was undeniable. But Alexander, was he even human? That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Not the Alexander I had met at the party, the one who seemed effortlessly charming and normal. No, this was the thing I'd seen on the stairs. His grotesque form barely humanoid, his grin too wide, his eyes too large, and his hair, those long, writhing strands that seemed alive, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. The whispers played in my mind like a broken record. He only attacks when the lights are out. He shows his true form when his victims are most scared. I began to piece it together, my hands trembling as I replayed the events of that night in my head. Alexander wasn't just some monster lurking in the shadows. He was a predator, feeding on fear. The whispers weren't just warnings, they were clues. The first condition was clear. He only attacked when the lights were out. That was why he had waited until the house was fully dark to reveal himself. It wasn't just a tactic. It was part of his nature. The second condition was more insidious. Alexander didn't just prey on fear. He needed it to strike. That was why he didn't attack me earlier, even when I was vulnerable. He waited until I froze, my body paralyzed by sheer terror, before lunging at me. It wasn't enough for him to scare his victims. He needed them at their peak fear, utterly helpless and unable to fight back. I shuddered, pulling the blanket tighter around myself. The thought was almost too much to bear. He had been playing with me, savoring my fear like a fine wine. Every moment of panic, every second I spent dreading what was to come, had been feeding him. I've tried to move on from that night, but it's impossible. I can't sleep with the lights off anymore. Even the faintest shadow sends a spike of panic through my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside my window feels like a prelude to something worse. And worst of all, I can't stop thinking about his words, that twisted robotic voice echoing in my head. What's wrong? Don't you want a sleepover? I don't know where Alexander is now, or if he's still out there hunting. But I do know one thing. He'll only attack if you let him. So if you ever feel that creeping fear, that paralyzing dread, remember this. Keep the lights on, and don't freeze.